Alpine Liquid Fertilizers is your full-season crop fertility specialist from start to finish. Visit alpinepfl.com for more.
Thank you for joining us here on The Agronomists. Your show sponsors include the Edible Bean School, the Successors, and the FMC Pre-School. FMC Pre-School is a product-agnostic program designed to equip growers and agricultural professionals with the latest tools and insights for effective weed management. From herbicide science to resistance trends, we're here to help you grow smarter. Learn more at fmcpreschool.com. Hello, everyone, and I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. Happy New Year. We are back. It is season 5 of The Agronomists, if you can believe it, episode 180, which is pretty darn cool, if you ask me. And I am so excited for tonight's conversation. But before I bring in our guests, a quick reminder, of course, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Let us know you took in the show, and we'll get you those CEU credits. I spent some time over the holidays planning for this season, for the topics that we're going to cover. And this one's a big one, and it is sure to get some conversations going, some questions, maybe even make a couple of people angry. Maybe. It's entirely possible. All right. Okay, producer Jay says my computer mic is working. Now my headset. I'll work on that. While I'm doing that, though, let's bring in our guests. I don't want to hit too many things, producer Jay, so I'm going to try my best here. Phil Needham with Needham Ag Technologies and Dr. David Lobb from the University of Manitoba joining us tonight to talk tillage erosion. All right, Dr. Lobb, we'll start with you. Tell us about what you do there at the University of Manitoba. What do you study?
I'm a professor in soil science, and I do a fair bit of teaching in soil and water management, soil and water conservation at the diploma level, so young farmers, as well as a degree in the graduate degree level. But much of my time is actually in research, and I deal with soil and water conservation, but tillage erosion quite specifically, and soil erosion. So I study wind erosion, water erosion, and I've spent a lot of my time in my career looking at tillage erosion. But I also look at water quality related issues that are also related, like phosphorus, eutrophication of lakes and algae blooms and that kind of stuff. So I do a broad range of work, and greenhouse gases and pesticide fate, etc. So, and my research has been pretty much all across this country and in the United States and a few other spots around the world.
Mm-hmm. All right. So now everybody knows why Dr. David Lobb is here. Someone, of course, who no stranger to Real Agriculture and to this program, who also feels very strongly about how much tillage we're doing. It's Phil Needham. Phil, how are you?
Hey, Lyndsey, doing great. Thank you. Happy New Year to you.
Yes, to you as well. All right. So what is keeping you busy? Of course, we're heading into the busy show season, conferences, etc. What's on the docket for you right now, Phil?
So it's obviously meeting season. I'm heading to the National No-Till Conference tomorrow in Louisville, Kentucky, and we've got snow and ice and actually thunder yesterday during the snow. That was a first for me. I didn't know there was such a thing. Yeah. But now the roads are improving a little bit, so conference season, meeting season, pretty strong right now for a lot of you guys too.
Mm-hmm, absolutely, yes. I have experienced the thunder during a snowstorm. It is very bizarre. But it does happen. Okay, so tonight's topic, we're going to talk about tillage erosion. We're going to talk about a few other forms of erosion as well. What causes it? And Dr. Lobb, you've got potentially some findings that some may find a little controversial, maybe a little surprising. But let's start with what the different types of erosion are. Walk me through the difference between tillage and water and wind, different types of erosion.
Sure, that's a good spot to start. And I have to admit, a lot of people are very confused about what tillage erosion is when they hear the term. So it is worth walking through what wind and water erosion are before you get to tillage erosion. So everyone's quite familiar with wind and water erosion. In North America, we've had conservation programs to reduce wind and water erosion since the dirty 30s. There's been a lot of effort in North America. Millions and millions and millions of dollars spent trying to modify practices, developing new equipment to maintain more residue on the soil surface to protect the soil against wind and water erosion, which are quite erosive. And there's been a lot of problems historically with wind and water erosion, both on farm and off farm. And that's what I was trained. And it was the only types of soil erosion that we would deal with until I started my master's. So I grew up and did my research in Southern Ontario, near Guelph. And when I started my research, one of the problems we had was the soil erosion patterns that are in the fields, the eroded hilltops that everyone sees everywhere around the world, didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense when it came to wind or water erosion. So they brought me in because my background, although I'm from a farm, I studied geomorphology. So I looked at landscape processes in general. And they brought me in because they thought I might have some insight or be able to tackle it. Well, it became very obvious right away that it wasn't things like solifluction or any of those types of other geomorphic processes. And it couldn't be wind or water erosion. The patterns just did not match the processes. There's just absolutely no way you could explain it. But looking at it, you'd start to realize, well, tillage is moving a lot of soil. So we started to look at how much soil was moved by tillage. And it didn't matter what scenario you were talking about, tillage erosion, when we did our measurements of soil movement by tillage, the soil loss by tillage erosion was always greater than the wind or water erosion. And that's the same thing out in the prairies. We find that everywhere we've looked, everywhere in the world, actually, everywhere in the world we've looked, whether it's in the tropics of China or in Central America or United States or Canada, all across Europe, tillage erosion always ends up being as erosive, if not more erosive, than wind and water erosion. But you have to be fairly specific about what you're thinking about. So this is a farmer's perspective. The soil loss I care about is the loss of topsoil that's causing me crop loss, and that's at the hilltops. And so it's important to realize that when we started looking at this, we were trying to figure out what was responsible for those eroded hilltops where the yields were dropping right off. There's no topsoil left, and the yields were dropping right off. And I may come back to that later on in the presentation. But that drove us to start measuring soil movement. And I don't know if you want to put the slide up showing what tillage erosion is, but it might help this part of the explanation. When you're moving soil around the field, and everyone who's tilled has a pretty good sense that they're moving soil. And whenever you're tilling, you're always dragging a bit more soil downslope than upslope. It doesn't matter which pass you're using or which equipment, which direction. If you lift soil up, there's always a little bit more that falls downslope than upslope. Whether you're doing contour tillage or tilling up and downslope, which is obviously the worst case scenario, you're always going to be moving more down than up. And the consequence of that is, if you're always moving soil away from a hilltop, you're going to lose topsoil there. If you're moving it down towards the hill bottom, you're going to be gaining topsoil there. And that's the pattern we see. And the picture that's showing on the screen there, that photo is actually just south of the border here near Fergus Falls, Minnesota, but it's pretty typical of everywhere where you have hilly ground in North America. And so that becomes the type of pattern that we saw in Southern Ontario, and you can see everywhere. I even pulled up some images from Google Earth from where Phil is, and you can see the exact same pattern there. You have these eroded hilltops, and that's not wind erosion, and it's certainly not water erosion. It's tillage erosion. You're always scraping soil off those hilltops. And the one way to think about this is, if you want to have a good appreciation for what tillage erosion is from a farmer's perspective, it's like dragging a road grader around your field with holes cut in the blade. And eventually, you're going to level that topsoil. You're going to level the landscape. And you get these images like what's shown there on the screen, where you have these eroded topsoils where there's no soil on the hilltop. And everyone probably appreciates that means very little crop yield. And the crop yield typically is about 30 to 70% of the field average. So it's quite a dramatic reduction. Some years it's 0%, right? Because you don't get anything yielding off of those. You may get a little bit of crop grind, but no yield. So it can be quite dramatic. And those areas are pretty darn large. Typically, it's about 5 to 15% of the hills or the land of a field that is moderately to severely eroded, like is what's shown here. And that means you're losing about 10% of your yield. That's not something you can afford to lose. You just don't give away 10% of your yield. And so that was the problem I came in to deal with. And we very quickly identified what the problem really was. And for the last 30 years, I've been trying to get people to be aware that what you're really trying to manage is not wind and water erosion, it's tillage erosion. And what you're really trying to control is soil movement, not crop residue cover. And so this is where that controversy comes up that you were referring to. It's trying to shift gears in what we think of as conservation tillage. And the other thing that's a bit of a concern, the way we've traditionally thought about conservation tillage, is we generally only describe conservation tillage as the crop residue cover at the time of seeding. So we only think about seedbed preparation when we start talking about conservation tillage, because we think that erosion only occurs before or after the crop. And that's fairly true of wind and water erosion. But there is a huge difference between managing crop residue and managing soil movement. And we might get into that, I suspect, in the discussion if any of the questions come up.
Absolutely. So Phil, in hearing that discussion and thinking about that timeline of 30 years of, really naming what this movement of soil is, what has your experience been in a move towards, less tillage, leaving that residue, et cetera, in thinking about the shift of potentially, minimizing soil movement versus thinking about what residue we're leaving?
Sure. Can I get Jason to put up slide number 1, please?
It's not the prettiest.
That's right. And this follows on exactly from where Dave was stating. So this is where approximately 3 or 4 miles at most south of where I grew up in England. So some of this ground has been farmed for literally hundreds of years. We farm now, and I'm actually the 5th generation of farming, but I'm farming in the US. But my family farm is still back in England. But there's lots of ground that looks exactly like slide number 1 that you see in England here. And what's going on, just as Dave said, and you've got to recognize that the English historically used to do a tremendous amount of tillage. They would disc a field to chop up the heavy residue. They would moldboard plow it. They would disc it once or twice. They would field cultivate it to try and level up what the disc had ridged up in the field, and the field cultivators were the worst from a tillage erosion perspective because they carry a lot of soil, and as they're going up and down the hills, obviously they're dragging more soil downhill. So just to kind of follow up from where Davis said, what we end up with on these hills is a completely different set of soil characteristics. The hilltops are more acidic generally, depending on where you are. The hilltops obviously have dramatically less organic matter, dramatically less nutrition from a point of view of pK and other nutrients, dramatically less sulfur, dramatically less nitrogen, and obviously less availability of nutrients over time through lack of organic matter. So I guess I'd like to start there, Lyndsey. Now, more and more all the time, obviously as farm incomes have begun to dwindle, obviously more recently with crop prices and input costs, a lot of European producers have gradually weaned off this deep, frequent tillage, more towards min-till. I actually worked on a farm in college in the mid-'80s that was actually doing direct seeding into cereal stubble with canola, oilseed rape over there, and wheat also. So I actually experienced some of the first direct seeding in England in the mid-'80s, and they had really, really good success with zero tilling. But back in that time, they were baling the straw to get the residue off. But I'm going to say that's kind of my take from an introduction perspective, okay?
Hey, can I follow up on that, Lyndsey?
Of course. Yes. These are the best episodes.
Your photo, Phil. So, Phil, when we talked, if everyone knows, we talked before tonight's session. And so I looked up where you we're from in England. And then, yeah, you see a lot of this landscape. But Google Earth is a fantastic tool for seeing how bad things really are. And in that area, it's pretty bad. But I have a positive story. In my experience, because I have colleagues that have been looking at tillage erosion on the western side of England, Devon and up near Lancashire. I went over there to see a tillage erosion experiment down outside of Exeter, north of Exeter in Devon. And they were looking at soil movement, and they're finding the same results we were finding. But on the drive up to the field site, I looked off to a field that we're driving past and said, stop, we have to talk to this guy. There was a farmer out there, and he was out there with his moldboard plow, and he had a rollover moldboard plow. Mm-hmm. And he was throwing the furrow directly upslope by going at about a 35-degree angle on the diagonal, up and back. So he's throwing the furrow upslope. And I said, why are you doing this? And he said, well, if I didn't do this, all the soil would be at the bottom of the hill. Mm-hmm. And so for the moldboard plow, it's the only one he had a rollover tool. He very deliberately struck an angle where he's throwing the furrow upslope to offset all of the downslope movement by all the other passes. And he said that when he was, his father, when he was young, they would, what they refer to as trucks, which we think of as wagons, they would get the soil and they would pick it up at the bottom and take it up to the top of the hill. This relates to one of the comments in the comment section here. Yeah. And they would take the soil up to the top of the hill and dump it on the hilltops, which were eroded. And this was a common practice. It was so common that it was actually written into the land tenancy agreements that they used to have. So if you were going to be a tenant, you were required to move topsoil back up to the hilltop. So this is quite a common practice, and something that we've ignored in North America.
Largely, yes.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. But it's now becoming more and more apparent. So anyway, it shows the innovation of farmers and their ability to recognize what the problem is and to come up with their own solutions. So I love that example. So I got photos of this farmer doing this.
Yeah. And using what you got. He's got a moldboard plow. So you're using what you have, which is something we'll talk about tonight. Okay. But it does bring up an excellent question. And we are going to talk a bit about not just what we do about this, but of course, avoiding this. And Phil, you've got some great slides on that as well. But to Jason's point about that question, I certainly have heard that question before of, can we, especially now, in this day and age of mapping and GPS and precision equipment and variable rate, all those things, is there a good way of exactly that, of moving soil back up slope or to those eroded knolls, or is it still really a very tedious process of scooping and dumping?
No. But historically, people have done it. So I've met farmers in China that have done this with baskets. That's a standard practice. Wow. I've seen photos in France back in the 1930s and doing it. So it's a practice they do. But obviously, you don't want it to have that effect anyway. You don't want to create that problem. So you want to minimize the tillage. You don't want to do tillage that you don't have to do. And there is lots of reasons why historically people did a lot of tillage. And we should be able to overcome a lot of those issues they were dealing with and not do as much tillage. So that would be the first thing you would do. And then the other thing you have to realize, just going to conservation tillage or no-till specifically, there's a whole bunch of issues around no-till. But one thing you have to realize, no-till just stops the problem, doesn't reverse the problem. So when you have that degraded photo like Phil showed, where you have all those eroded hilltops there, just going to no-till is not going to make that any better. It's just going to stop it from getting worse. And so then you're really stuck with the situation. Are you okay with losing 10% of your yield because on 15% of your landscape you have no topsoil left? Or are you going to do something about it? And I will make this very strong statement that simply going to no-till will not restore your soils. It stops them from getting worse. There's no way around that. And so you have to appreciate that fact. You really have to do something more intervention, a stronger intervention than simply going to no-till. You do have to consider what those farmers do is moving soil back up. Now there are lots of ways you can try and do that. as I mentioned, there's farmers using a rollover mobile plow, moving the soil back up. We've also got farmers out here with earth movers who've been doing this for decades
Yep.
that no one's ever
I've
bothered to
seen it.
notice.
Yeah.
And they've been doing that, again, outside of research and outside of government extension. They've been doing this because they realize the potential benefit of it. And to be honest, moving the topsoil back up, you get an immediate response and you get a complete restoration. Whereas if you go to no-till, you're essentially arresting the problem. You're not improving it.
Okay.
And so it's really an important thing to consider. I'm glad Jason brought that up. It probably would have come up later in the discussion, but it's quite an important point.
It is. And Phil, like, to that end, because I know that a lot of the work you do, you're working with, of course, zero-till or min-till. You're working with potentially, strip tillage and different things, as well as cover crops, incorporating cover crops into these systems. What has your experience been in exactly that, in minimizing the impact of this, or potentially trying to improve what's out there on the fields that you're working with?
So obviously, from my perspective, what we're looking to do is utilize no-till where possible. And I'm not going to sit here this evening and say no-till works everywhere. It doesn't. But I think no-till works in most areas if you want and are willing to try to make it work. And in many situations, it takes different seeding equipment. The same seeding equipment that you've used for 10, 20 years, or style of seeding equipment, may not work in a no-till system. You may need a heavier version with more down pressure that's better able to cut through residue, better able to cut through harder, drier soils, perhaps. It may need some kind of residue management, different closing wheels for higher moisture soils. But I guess for the past 34 years or so, I've worked one-on-one with a lot of different farmers, and I've helped a lot of farmers implement no-till systems. And many of those guys, flat out at the beginning just said no-till won't work. And I've done a lot of work even with some of the universities. For example, the University of Kentucky, we did a lot of cooperative work with them, including Dr. Lloyd Murdoch, the former soil scientist out of UK in Kentucky here. And we did on-farm comparisons, what we call cooperative on-farm comparisons, where we went to growers that are skeptical about no-till and laid out some squares in the field and used no-till equipment that was set up to no-till. And we did on-farm comparisons over time. And I think we did 18 or 21 side-by-side comparisons, different locations, different site years. And, the no-till was equal or slightly better from a yield perspective, but from a profitability perspective, it was significantly better. And I think it'd be even more so today with the fuel and equipment costs. So that's kind of a little background on my input. Again, I'm not here to tell everybody they need to no-till, but I think there's a lot of people that could successfully no-till if they set their equipment up to do so. From my perspective, in the areas that I work with, Dave, I think no-till can help improve organic matter slightly, and it's very slow. You hear people at conferences saying they've raised organic matter by 2% in 5 years. It's unless they're applying a huge amount of manure, no. But not in my opinion. But I think very, very, very slowly you might see a 0.1 or 0.2% increase in organic matter over 10 or 20 years. That's my take.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of evidence, and the results are mixed, and it depends which region you're in terms of ag climate, whether or not you should expect those types of increases. In some areas, you get no increase. And it can be very much dependent on whether or not you're producing as much biomass and yield as you in the no-till versus the conventional till, because that's the input of the carbon, right? If you're not growing an equal crop, you're not having an equal carbon input. So it's all a question of budgeting inputs and outputs. And so photosynthetic carbon comes from the atmosphere, and it comes via the crop growth. And so I would agree with everything you said. And no-till should be an obvious thing for many people in a wide variety of situations, soil conditions, climate conditions. You should be able to minimize the tillage and move towards something that most people call no-till. Now, there are issues that we've come up across North America that what some people call no-till now is not what we called no-till 30 years ago.
Right. Yes.
And
Now, and we are going to talk. We've got to. I'm going to go to the clip here for just a moment and go to the read. But one of the key things I want to talk about is the type of tillage and the type of implement we're choosing. But one of the other things that factors in here is speed. And so this clip is from a canola school with Marla Reichman, where there were some demonstrations put on just to show just how speed impacts the amount of distance, that the amount of soil and the distance it will travel during tillage. So producer Jay, if you would, we'll go to the clip with Marla Reichman.
So tillage erosion is the biggest erosive effect out of all of the different types of erosion that we see in the Canadian prairies. A lot of people focus on wind or water erosion as being the biggest impact, and they forget about the fact that the tillage tool actually moves more soil than anything else. So if we're thinking about the effect of tillage or moving soil with iron up and over a hill or even on a flat landscape, that will move things more so than the wind and water. The issue, though, is that tillage also makes the soil more susceptible to wind and water erosion because it breaks up or pulverizes soil surface, and then just basically the soil is more apt to fly or float at that point.
So what can you tell me about speeds when it comes to that?
Okay, so speed is a big factor and something that people don't always think about. So when we think about tillage from the past, we think about something like a moldboard plow, where basically you would take a big chunk of soil and flip it upside down completely. You move a lot of soil a short distance. Yes, it's very erosive in that case, but when you actually start picking up speed, soil flies a lot farther or moves farther, or with more variability. So if you're going up and over the hill or like uphill or downhill, you get more variability with higher speed. So when we see this movement to high-speed discs or shallow tillage, we think of it more as, say, conservation tillage because it's not going as deep, but we're moving with such great speed, we cause a lot of variability in soil movement, and quite often soil moves a lot farther than we think it's going to. So that becomes a bigger issue, especially where we're seeing these transitions after some wet years to using more of these residue management type tools in no-till land. And so there is a risk of having higher tillage erosion happening again with these types of tools.
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are the FMC Pre-School, Edible Bean School, and the Successors. Real Agriculture highlights the next generation of agriculture, the up-and-comers. Featuring interviews with the young crowd, the Successors dives into mentorship, marketing, implementing new ideas on the farm, careers off the farm, and so much more. Download from Real Agriculture's podcast feed or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, producer Jay tells me that my sound is still no good, but no one's here to listen to me anyway, so it's totally fine. Okay, so a few things out of that discussion that Marla brings up, and I think this is a key one to touch on, that, of course, when we till soil, we do leave it open, potentially more likely to, as she says, fly or float. So that is a consideration, that we're not just moving soil, we're potentially breaking it up and exposing it to other forms of erosion, and that speed is a factor. But she also talks about the different implements. And so, David, I'll go to you first on some of the work that you've done and what we looked at. There's discussion that, these conservation tillage implements maybe are not as benign as we've been led to believe. Why is that, if that is the case?
A great example is the chisel plow, which was the alternative to the moldboard plow, and doesn't go as deep, leaves residue on the surface. So it's considered to be an ideal alternative to the moldboard plow. If you don't want to go to no-till, you just want to reduce your tillage. The only problem is, as Marla describes it, she's an excellent advocate for this work. The moldboard plow doesn't actually move soil very far. It just rolls it. There's some that goes, and we do very detailed measurements of how far soil gets moved. It doesn't move very far, whereas a chisel plow, it moves less soil, but at higher speed and much further distance. So a moldboard plow may move soil between, like 1 foot and 3 feet. Chisel plow moves it between 4 feet and 8 feet or 10 feet. Wow. It really throws and drags soil. And the problem is, the farther it moves it with greater variability. So that when I talked earlier on about soil moving downslope more than moves upslope, you have a tremendous impact. So the chisel plow is usually about twice as erosive as a moldboard plow when it comes to tillage erosion. So you may be reducing wind and water erosion, which isn't your problem, but you're creating a huge tillage erosion problem. And probably the most extreme case of that, which we don't think about, we talk about conservation tillage, focus on seedbed preparation, primary and secondary tillage. But one thing that we decided to take a look at, and we were just astounded by, in the prairies, we use high disturbance seeders. And so they leave residue on the soil up until seeding, and then they go in and they seed. So in Ontario, where I grew up, they would use a double disc opener and essentially create a slot. You may have trash whippers or something that moves residue into the row area to warm up the soil, dry it out in the row area. But we use more, I would characterize as more aggressive row openers, seed row openers here in the prairies. And we often refer to as high disturbance seeding. Well, guess what? The high disturbance seeding, which we use in zero till, our version of no till, will actually cause as much tillage erosion as a moldboard plow. It doesn't move very much soil, but it moves it at such high speed and such great distances and such huge difference between upslope and downslope. The result is the same amount of tillage erosion as a moldboard plow. We did that in an experiment in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and found both exact same results. So it really does make you think about what is tillage. Right. And you have to consider all forms of soil disturbance as a form of tillage. And you have to consider, as I said earlier, how far soil moves, not just how much residue is on the surface. That may not actually be the biggest threat to what you're doing for crop production. It's how far the soil moves and how much variability. So that is quite important. And how far soil moves is certainly a function of how deep you till, but it's probably more a function of the speed. And part of the reason why speed is such a nasty thing is because when we buy our equipment, and I'm not sure how many people realize this, but when you buy a piece of equipment, Phil, and you look at the power requirements, the drawbar power requirements, how many horsepower per foot width of implement you need, all those types of ratings they have for equipment, you think they test them on hilly ground?
Of course not.
The Nebraska track test, which is the standard, is a flat field. Right. And so all of the power requirements that we have and what we're encouraged to buy is for flat land. And so if you take out a hilly piece of land, you're always going to be going faster downslope and slower upslope. You're going to be, because of that, throwing more soil because you're always trying to go faster to make up lost speed. Anyway, this huge variation in speed at high speed, and that creates a lot of erosion. And so soil, we didn't realize this when I started my research. We started to look at depth and speed, but it became pretty apparent over the last 20 years of looking at this, that speed is probably the number one issue. Mm-hmm. And it's one that farmers are not aware of, and it's not just primary and secondary tillage. It's also seeding. And the worst of all of the crop production systems is potato production, because the seed piece, the placement of seed pieces involves soil movement, a lot of it. Every hilling operation involves a lot of soil movement. And then the harvesting involves a heck of a lot of soil movement. So when she was referring to the distance soil is moved, I mentioned the moldboard plow moves it between 1 and 3 feet, and chisel plow 4 to maybe 6 to 8 feet. How far do you think soil moves during potato hilling and harvesting, that whole sequence? How far do you think soil moves?
8 feet, because we have to guess. This is a great game.
Oh, no, it's a great guess. Yeah, well, it's a good guess, but you're way off. We measured 21.8 meters.
What? Meters?
Meters, not feet. It was dragging some soil, not all of it, though, but some of it. But the thing is, it's that little bit at the end is where you get the variation between upslope and downslope. Right. So the post-seeding, or the seeding and post-seeding operations of potato production was so much more erosive than all the intensive primary and secondary tillage combined.
Yep. Okay, hang on. We're going to pause there. Mark, you're reading my mind. So my question to you, Phil, okay, so in thinking about and David, if I may paraphrase,
Mhm.
the thinking is that we need to think about every pass on the field, not just our tillage passes per se. And Mark points out, I mean, we're talking about comparison to the mobile plow, but the mobile plow is a step one. That's not, you don't
Oh, yeah.
go and plant into a mobile plow field, right? I mean, I guess you do if you hate yourself. I don't know. Who whatever, but obviously there are subsequent passes that go after. So if we are, of course, lining up one tillage pass to another, the
Yeah.
plow, of course, moves a chunk of soil, but not very far. But Phil, when we think about, when that tillage happens as well, right? So we think about what has to happen after. And if we're thinking about, that planting pass, that we are trying to minimize soil disturbance because we're trying to do zero till or min till, how then do you approach this idea of tillage erosion on a seeding pass if we're thinking about going into heavy residue? Which, if anyone's seen your last pictures, Phil, of when you were on, the amount of residue that you plant into where you are is quite astounding for most of us in Ontario. We all just think slugs, but apparently you don't deal with slugs. Anyway, so how
Sometimes
to,
we do.
sometimes, yeah.
So let me go back to Mark's point, and he had a good question. Obviously, the moldboard plow is one pass across the field. And I mentioned in that, actually, with that example I showed, it's very common in England historically for a farmer to disc a field, moldboard plow, and then he disc it 2 or 3 times to try and level it out. Then he go back in there with the harrows with leveling boards that pull a huge amount of soil, similar to what Dave's talking about. So it is about multiple passes. So we need to reduce the depth of tillage so we don't have to make the number of sequential passes after the initial moldboard plow or chisel plow pass. Obviously, getting the tillage depth down will help. In Marla's video, absolutely. Vertical tillage at 7, 8, 9, 10 miles an hour, you're throwing a lot of soil. So, that needs to be considered also. From a point of view of managing it at planting time, I mean, the guys that we're working with now, like I've said previously, we're equipping a planter to try and do the scratching of the seed row ahead of the double disc openers on a planter with perhaps a residue manager. So 2 row cleaner wheels parting the residue, lightly scratching the soil surface, planting into that scratched soil surface. And then we got some more aggressive than factory closing wheels, which are going to close that seed slot in higher residue no-till conditions. I mean, at some point, that's the direction that I think more people need to go. I did mention at the start, I worked on a farm that did some of the first direct seeding that I'd ever been around. And the reason that they did that, I think the previous year to starting out on direct seeding, they bought a new fuel tank that had a gallon meter on it. So every time tractors were filled up, the operators, including myself, was expected to write down the fuel use and what we did that day or the previous day to use that many gallons. And they were actually horrified, and that's the reason it prompted them towards the direct seeding. They were horrified as to how many gallons of fuel they were using a year in the tillage operations. They just thought it was equal on harvesting and spraying and spreading and tillage, but tillage was by far the greatest user of fuels, and obviously they were making so many tillage passes across the field, that's where it was going to.
Mm-hmm.
So from a dollar and cents perspective, we need to be thinking about less tillage.
Right.
And all forms of tillage, which came up, and someone asked about the different types. We've done measurements on many types, and so have my colleagues in other parts of the world. And I use moldboard plow because that's when people talk about tillage. That's the iconic image everyone thinks about in North America is the moldboard plow. Although, well, not everyone's using a moldboard plow still. Hopefully, very few people are, but there's still lots. But tandem disc is actually worse than the moldboard plow. And that's because the way that the tools are designed, it throws the soil. And if you have a tandem disc, you've got 2 gangs of tools.
That's right. Yeah.
And so you throw a lot more soil. But Phil's right, though. If you understand the nature of the problem, it means you can very thoughtfully think about, well, how can I reduce the depth of tillage, make sure I'm not underpowering the implement that I'm dragging around. eliminate all the unnecessary tillage. And I would say that people that are more tuned into the soil biology now, and I think biology came up in some of the earlier comments, I think we all appreciate that we recognize that tillage, intensive tillage, in particular unnecessary tillage, is damaging the soil biology, which makes the soil less productive, less healthy, less resilient. There's no real upside to doing excessive tillage. I just don't understand why people would do it. But then there's the obvious thing that Phil mentioned, is the gas consumption. Time and gas, the fuel consumption, is massive for doing excessive tillage.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, though, that there's at times we focus on the yields, total yields. We don't always talk about profitability per acre, right?
Yep.
So we look at, and a lot of the no-till or min-till or different tillage treatment options, when we compare, we often take it to yields. We don't always take it to profitability, which I think is pretty important. Now, one of the questions, though, centers around, okay, so how do we stop this from happening or minimize it? In that, and we've talked about how we can sort of, if we've already got eroded knolls, that reducing tillage or going to zero till may stop further erosion, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. But let's say I've got a field that it's showing some erosion. I realize now I've perhaps been dragging around my tillage tools, and moving soil all over the place. I still, let's say, theoretically, I still need to do some sort of passes. Are there better tools, or is it about speed and settings and those sorts of things? Dave, I'll start with you, and then Phil, I'd love to know sort of how you broach this too.
That's a really tough question, because no one has ever designed equipment with the idea of moving less soil. But it's very obvious that that if you're moving residue, you're moving soil, and you're just trying to minimize the soil residue disturbance, and you're going to minimize the soil movement, hopefully. But I mentioned it's not necessarily the case. You can have, as I said, with the chisel plow, leave lots of residue in the surface, but completely destroy your soil. There's not a real good answer. If you gave me $10 million to do research over the next 10 years, I could probably give you much better answers. But part of the problem is government agencies, and industry particularly, has been absolutely resistant to doing research in this. So those are great questions, but we will probably never have good answers. It will come from farmers' experience, with them being aware of what they're doing to the soil. Their observations will help fine-tune the selection of equipment and its operation. So if they know that the movement of soil is problematic, they know that underpowering the equipment is problematic, monitoring speed is one way you can track to see how bad things are. All of those things become important ways to improve our understanding of the tillage. But I wouldn't hazard a definitive answer of what to do, but I would probably say going to a no-till system is probably the most effective way to reduce wind and water erosion, obviously, but also tillage erosion. But it does not eliminate the erosion. Depending on how you do zero-till or no-till, you can still have tillage erosion. And a great example, when I moved to the prairies, I started working with the Manitoba Zero-Till Research Association. And some of the original people in the prairies doing no-till or zero-till were part of that group. And I remember one farmer said, we've been doing zero-till for 20 years, and I'm still not getting any improvement on my hilltops and yield. It's still degraded. What's going on with this? It's supposed to get better. Well, part of the problem is you can't improve productivity in soils on those eroded hilltops. You're not growing a crop very effectively. It's very difficult to restore the soil. But the other problem was they were using high disturbance seeders. So they were any movement improvement they had in the soils, they were eliminated every year with the seeding operation they were doing. So it is pretty complicated coming up with a perfect solution. And I think to be realistic, there is no perfect solution. If you're doing crop production, you're going to be moving soil. So accept that. Figure out how to move less soil is probably the best thing to do. Move soil with less degradation. So you can move a lot of soil, but don't move it with a lot of variability. This gets back to Marla's point about speed. If you can monitor the speed and you can minimize that variation in speed. You're going to minimize how much soil you move and how much erosion that soil movement creates. So you're never going to eliminate soil movement, but you need to move the soil with less erosive outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Now, you bring up a good point, and we've talked about this on the show many times, that one of the best cover crops or the best things to feed a soil is the best crop you can grow, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
Biomass, right? Biomass feeds biomass. So Phil, in thinking about that, in thinking about those eroded knolls, how do you broach management of those eroded knolls, knowing that it's not going to grow the same crop that perhaps the lower areas are going to? What does that look like as far as a plan goes on how you manage eroded knolls?
Sure, and that's a really good question. There's a lot of variables behind that question, but I'm going to say in generality, number one, we've got to grow as good a crop. Job number one has got to be to grow as good of a crop, whether that's a cereal grain that you're raising for income, or a cover crop, which is obviously getting you some biomass and some rooting mass in the off season, assuming you're in an area where there's moisture and growth potential. Here in Kentucky, we've had a massively warm fall. I had tillage radish that I sowed on the field next to the shop where I'm at now, and it was still living till about the middle of December. Now, we had a cold enough event, it killed it. But we've had a very mild fall, which was very good for cover crop growth. So after the soybean came off here, we planted actually a mix of different cover crops, of which one of the crops within it was tillage radish. And they have some benefits in addition to the crimson clovers that we use for going ahead of corn, ideally. But I think doing the best job you can in those eroded areas. Obviously, number one, you've got a plan to try and reduce erosion over time, trying to reduce the number of tillage passes or eliminate tillage altogether, perhaps. Grow as good a crop as you can, which may mean some additional nutrition, some additional NPK if the soils are found to be low or deficient. Maybe some manure. There's some chicken houses around here. There's some cattle farms. Applying some site-specific manure to those eroded areas, I think, could be beneficial. Anything that you can do to add some life and some organic matter to those hills, I think, could be huge. That's my take on that, Lyndsey.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to throw out there, because once an episode I have to mention them. But if you have cover crops and you plan to graze those cover crops, you could also potentially leave the animals there longer and feed them on the hilltops with brought-in feed if you really wanted to. Anyway, just throwing it out there. All right, David, did you want to add to this? Oh, good.
I got a comment on cover crops. Because cover crops are great. It's a way to get the photosynthetic carbon into the soil. You want to have as much plant growth as humanly possible. That's the only way to improve organic matter, right? That's the way to get it there. The only concern we have with things like cover crops is in the prairies, is that you're in a semi-arid, subhumid environment. The problem is, if you put a cover crop in, you're robbing the soil of its moisture for the next year's crop. We rely on excess moisture carrying over to support the next crop. If you eliminate that, you're robbing your cash crop to feed your cover crop with moisture. So it's very problematic. The other thing I'd make comment about cover crops, in the evaluation of cover crops, and even the evaluation of crop varieties even, how many people do you see doing research on the areas that actually need it? Like the eroded areas. I have never seen a cover crop study looking at the eroded areas where you're trying to get more carbon back into the soil. No. And so, Phil, I don't know if you've ever seen that. And I thought about this when you're mentioning about doing plot research. Typically, the plot research is always on the flat, ideal growing areas when they're evaluating things like cover crops. It's never on the areas that actually need the organic matter.
That's right. And I'll give you
whether you noticed that or not.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. And we always put replicated research plots in flat areas of the fields with a contiguous soil type. So your statistics, CVs are generally pretty tight. You don't want a lot of variability in your treatments, but you're absolutely right. And from a sulfur perspective, we're switching gears to nutrition, Lyndsey, and to sulfur.
That's okay.
But we see a lot of sulfur deficiencies in eroded hilltops and some of these eroded hillsides where we don't see it in the flat fields or the flat areas. So when we're doing replicated research, we're doing it in the flat areas and not on the hillside. So Dave's absolutely right, but it's difficult to do replicated trials on hillsides because there's lots of different soil characteristics, topsoil depths, and you got a lot of variability in the trials. But he's absolutely right. Nobody does research there.
Okay.
Except,
go ahead.
There is one study that I'll make mention of. It was initiated. This goes back to Peter Johnson's time when I was working with him. There was a study done in Southern Ontario called Tillage 2000, which Gary Kachanowski set up with a bunch of farmers. And I think there was like 32 sites in total, of which 16 or 18 were intensive sites, side by side strips, field scale strips over the hilly land. And so they were monitoring all of these points along these strips where they had different soil conditions, different yields. And they were comparing zero till or no till typically with conventional till, sometimes minimum till versus conventional till. And they did that for a number of years, from 86 or 87 to 1992. So I went back in the last few years. We've been trying to collect information on these sites, and we resampled them. And quite interestingly, these strip trials, although they've all been abandoned, they've gone to no-till. We went back in to see whether or not after 32 years, whether no-till, because it should have restored the soils. But what I was told as a student working on this and as a researcher in the early part of my career, that no-till would remedy the problem. Right. Well, guess what? After 32 years, the 10% yield loss on those hilltops that are eroded, they're still eroded. They didn't improve. They didn't get worse, but they didn't improve. Right. And you still have a 10% yield loss. Has not improved the situation. Now, what creates a problem with interpreting that is crop yields over the last 30 or 40 years have doubled to tripled. Right. And so from a farmer's perspective, they don't care that they're losing it because they're making more yield and more profit on the rest of the field. So they're quite complacent about, or they don't see the need to go in and restore those areas because the yield and the profits keep going up. The gross profits, not necessarily the net profits. But you could argue that, the gross profits have gone up, but the net profits may actually be being hurt. And they're certainly not making as much money as they could have if they'd been able to restore those eroded areas. But that's the only trial that I am aware of that was done properly at the time, back in the late 80s, early 90s. And when we've gone back in, it just blows me away that everything I was told doesn't actually work. So this is the controversial thing I think you were referring to at the start, Lyndsey. Oh, you're muted.
Possibly. Yep. Yeah, no, I had to for a moment there. It's part of it. Okay, I'm going to go to our last read of the night. And then I want to come back to this, but also, Phil, I do want to touch on rain events, because I promised we would talk about this, and I think it's a cool sort of dovetail to this conversation. So, Producer Jay, if you would, our last read of the night. Our sponsors tonight are the Successors, FMC Pre-School, and the Edible Bean School. From planning and seeding to fertility and nutrient management decisions to harvest and storage, Real Agriculture's Edible Bean School is a video series that tackles every facet of the edible bean growing season in an engaging and informative format. The Edible Bean School is made possible through sponsorship by Hensel Co-op. Check out more on YouTube. All right, so one of the things we've talked about certainly is eroded knolls, eroded hilltops, removing soil within the slope positions. We're not necessarily always losing it per se, but we're moving it, and we're losing productivity in those areas. We've also sort of tackled that, we probably can't improve those areas if we stop tillage. It's going to require more than that. It's going to require some additions. Now, but there are other aspects, and we mentioned this, that, tilling a soil does potentially leave it open for other losses, wind and water erosion. And Phil, you and I, in setting this episode up, we talked about the advent of very intense rain events and the impacts that they can have on our soils, on our farmers' fields, and the difference that it can have to have a growing crop there, or a crop residue, a cover crop there potentially. Um, I want you've got a really good slide on this in a moment, but one of the things that I was surprised to learn was the impact that a single raindrop can have on bare soil is quite remarkable when you actually look at the force by which it hits the soil surface, and just how impactful that can be. And so Phil, was it slide 8 or slide 13, I think? Producer
I
Jay, it's
think
the one with the cover crop on the one side and the water running across the road.
Okay, sure. That'd be slide
That
number 8.
one. There you
I
go.
tell you
Okay.
what, if you
So
wouldn't mind, could we
yeah,
start perhaps with slide number 4, if that's
sure.
possible?
Of course. Yep.
Then we'll move into that.
There we go.
So,
Yep.
to
Perfect.
Lyndsey's point, I guess the point I asked Lyndsey to discuss, or a prompt to discuss tonight, is this issue of more intense rainfall. And I hate to talk about heavy rains because I'm fully cognizant that there's probably guys in Swift Current or Lethbridge that don't get but 10, 12, 15 inches of rain a year. And here we are talking about, massive rainfall events. But what we're seeing is some incredibly intense rainfall events in a lot of the areas that I work in. And this one specifically is in Kentucky. And a lot of weather apps now will actually chart, and I don't know how accurate it is, but they're charting rainfall intensity per hour. And on that screen capture I show on the screen, they're showing 421 millimeters per hour of rainfall intensity within that purple area. And the reason I was interested in this, I've got wheat not far from there. And if you've got wheat, I think this was during early grain fill. So if you've got a super intense rainfall event during the grain filling stages of wheat, you got flat wheat, which is never good. And I'm not saying that front would be there more than 5 or 10 minutes, because 421 millimeter per hour intensity, assuming that app is anything like close, is the equivalent to 16.6 inches of rainfall per hour. Now, I said underneath that in brackets, maybe that was present for 10 minutes. But if it was 10 minutes, that's 2 3/4 inches of rainfall. I have a huge amount of respect for Dr. Dwayne Beck at Dakota Lakes Research Farm. And I was at his research farm for a field day a few years ago. And he was emphatic that he didn't get any erosion in his irrigated plots when he put 2 inches of rainfall on them in an hour. But some of these rainfall intensities, we've got 2 3/4 inches of rain in 10 minutes. So my challenge is, for anybody doing tillage, the probability of soil movement goes way up when you've got a super high rainfall intensity. And Jay, if you could show image number 6, I've got an example of some of these fields, some of the soil loss. I took this picture, and obviously this is a work field. You can see all kinds of water running off the field, but this was taken shortly after one of those super high rainfall events. So if you've got ground that's worked with no soil cover hardly at all, the amount of topsoil that you're losing, and that's some of the most nutrient-rich soil that's leaving that field to disappear on down the ditch for the road department to clean out and run across the road, creating hazards. That's the challenge that we're seeing with some of these super high rainfall events. And to contrast that, Jay, if you could go to slide 8 that we was going to show just a minute ago, when I took that previous image a moment ago showing the soil washing off the field, I drove down the road to this field, and if you look on the right-hand side of the road, there's a green cover crop growing, and the water is running from right to left downhill, and the water coming off that field is almost clear. It's not quite, but there's little to no topsoil leaving that field with a living crop growing with no tillage. The difference is massive.
Mm-hmm. We have experienced several of these, and not always in the growing season, that's for sure. It seems to be, and I can remember just a couple of years ago, we had a November rainstorm that came through, and so that, of course, is all falling. I think it was 4 inches in less than 2 hours, and it was all on, of course, heavily tilled fields potentially because of just the time of year, which we know is part of that risk. Now, to keep things, to keep everybody honest, we've also got Dr. Lobb. We've got a slide that we have to show so that if we're going to get controversy going, this will be it. Producer Jay, I think it's slide 1, the way you've numbered them of Dr. Lobb's, but maybe it's slide 3. It's either the first or the last. No, it's not this one. It's the next one, I think. But we could start there if you want.
Oh,
Okay, there we go. Okay,
Yes.
is that fine too? Either way. Okay, but
Yeah,
this
it is
is
quite-
yeah. Walk us through this.
Yeah, because when and what Phil just described, you have wind and water erosion has been the focus because it is so conspicuous. You see pictures like Phil was showing, and there is concern that they're getting those storms getting more intense, and those photos that we see and those images are becoming more frequently observed, and it's quite a concern. And I'm not saying that there's not a serious concern, and we have designed conservation programs around protecting water quality and air quality. And let's be honest, that's what they were. They were protecting water quality. Whether it's in Chesapeake Bay or whether it's Lake Erie or Lake Winnipeg, it's all about protecting water quality. That's what the public's interested in. The public doesn't give a rat's ass about your soil and your soil's productivity. They care about whether or not you're contaminating their water. And so, to be honest, that's actually what's driven a lot of the interest in government supporting conservation programs, because it's always been sold that if you protect the soil quality and protect soil erosion, protect the soil from erosion, you will protect the water quality. And Phil, your photo does show that. It does do that, but that's not the whole story. It does reduce the occurrence of those water erosion events. And they are, they're not on every field every year. They are in the fields that are poorly managed, the ones that happen to have an intense rainstorm at that point in time or intense windstorm when it comes to wind erosion. But that's not every field every year. If you look at the whole landscape, and I would argue that even if you looked at that field that you showed, that one year, that one storm, it's pretty spectacular. And that doesn't mean there's not a lot of tillage erosion going on. The problem with tillage erosion is very inconspicuous. It's a very slow, progressive thing that occurs on every damn square foot of your field. And it's slowly eating away at it. And I bet you if you go to those fields and if you look at those fields, go to Google Earth, you will find that where you see the evidence of soil loss is not where you have that water run. It is going to be on the hilltops around it. And I make that point because in reality, those processes work together. Tillage erosion is moving the soil from the hilltops, creating that yield problem that we were talking about. But where does it move the soil? It moves it right into those water runs. And so we see the worst case scenario is moving the eroded topsoil, this nice rich topsoil, down into those water runs where water converges and washes it off the field. And you get a balance between water and tillage erosion, which we can see. We go out to those fields and we can actually characterize that balance. And quite often in the prairies, there's so little water erosion, even though we have those storms and occasionally we get those types of events that you were showing. But generally speaking, those water runs, they will have an intact soil profile because the net balance of tillage erosion and water erosion, they're moving more in with tillage erosion than moving it with water erosion. And without showing photos, it makes it kind of hard to get that across. But there are multiple erosion processes going on within any of these fields. It's not just one or the other. And there is a balance there. And tillage erosion occurs on every piece, every square foot of land that's being tilled, you're moving soil. With wind and water erosion, that's not the case. And They occur in very localized areas, very intense events, which are highly conspicuous. Doesn't mean they're not a problem. Doesn't mean they're not a serious problem. But the fact that you don't see tillage erosion every time someone's operating a piece of equipment, you don't see the hilltops just being completely eliminated of topsoil, does not mean it's not occurring. It's a very slow, progressive process. And so I think it's important to realize that if you're trying to look at soil quality for soil productivity and profitability, the solutions are going to be different than the solutions to protect water quality. And the more and more we look at it, we realize those two things are not as equal as we thought of in the 70s and 80s, when we were told, well, all you have to do is protect the soil by covering it with crop residue, and you'll solve the water quality problem, and you'll solve the soil quality problem. And that's not the case. And so that's the point of this slide. And it is quite important to realize that there are different interests. There are public interests, and there's crop production interests, and the farmer's interests. And they are not necessarily one and the same.
And I mean, there is, though, as you've explained, I mean, there is crossover, right? Things that are healthy for our soil and our soil productivity do help potentially in protecting waterways, etc.
Oh,
but they're
absolutely.
not right. But they're not necessarily equal. And some of the practices would be different, and it's still a viable goal to want to protect your soil and increase your soil productivity, but that's not necessarily what our programs have been designed for. If I'm
exactly, and I think you do want to you want to try and minimize wind, water, and tillage erosion. You want to minimize them all to sustain your productivity and hopefully increase your productivity. So you shouldn't just ignore wind and water erosion, focus on tillage erosion. That would be folly as well. It would be equally as dumb as what was done back in the 60s and 70s, in my opinion.
We're not going to get into everything that happened then. Finally, though, because we are running out of time, if we can go to Producer Jay, Producer Jay offers this comparison. It's like having Brussels sprouts with your Big Mac. That would be dumb. Just have the Brussels sprouts. They're delicious. Can we, Phil sent that great photo of the Palouse region that I want to end on this because I am from the prairies. I think that, here in the Ottawa Valley, we have hills. But realistically, there are some places that farm some pretty phenomenal hills. I think it's slide 1 or 2, Jay, I think.
2.
I think it's 2. And maybe we'll end on that. There you go. It still amazes me that, and that's not even the biggest hill I've seen, but it's a pretty sizable one.
Sure, I took that picture. That's near Colfax, Washington, obviously in the Palouse. And there's lots of things going on, and we could always, Dave and myself could talk about this and compare and contrast many different management practices over time. But the number of things, number one, you got the tillage erosion perspective, and you're pretty sure there's not a significant amount of water erosion just because it's a pretty low rainfall area. But the intriguing thing is, I'm pretty sure they told me that the south-facing slopes have little to no topsoil because it's all wind moved over the top of the hills to the north-facing slopes, whereas some people have told me with a large excavator that digs down 15, 20 feet, they've dug down to full depth with that size trackhoe, and they were still in topsoil on the north side of the slope. So, I mean, if anybody hasn't been out into that area, just go, preferably during wheat harvest, so you can ride on a combine that's harvesting, wheat or any crop on these 40, 45% slopes. And I mean, they have auto leveling, but it's still amazing to see any equipment, whether it's a seeder or a sprayer or a harvester of any kind, harvesting on slopes of this intensity. It just blows my mind, and it'll scare you to death if you haven't done it before previously.
Actually, just thinking about it, Phil, I've been in a couple combines that were questionable, and they were nothing near that. So no, it terrifies me. You can go, and everybody else. I'll stay home.
When the combine starts sliding downhill to the side, you hang on to the
gosh.
Anything.
No, thank you. All right. Okay, we're going to leave it there. we've got, thank you everyone for some great comments and some great questions. There's one that's come in a bit late. We'll maybe take that offline and tackle some of that. I will put it out there. If you've got follow-up questions, if you've got questions for my guest, of course, tonight, you can zip me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com. We can, of course, get you some answers as well, put you in touch if you've got some other ones as well. Thank you, Dr. Lobb, Phil Needham, for joining me tonight, for kicking off the year, for kicking off season 5. I appreciate it. Lots to think about. So thank you both for sharing your time and your expertise. And we'll be back, of course, next week, 8 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking AI in agronomy. So check that out. Have a great night. Thank you all. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you.
Lyndsey. Thanks, Dave. Cheers.